So we've chatted about the overarching challenges with mixing metal music, and you've talked about some of the approaches that you've used on previous productions. When it came to this mix, this track in Solitude with the multitrack, what were the central challenges here, and how did that inform your mix focus?
Well, we'll just go sort of top to bottom, and I'll remember as we look. Like, one of the things that was really difficult is the very intro has the blast kick with nothing else, and then that one snare hit. When they're exposed, they have to sound great. Once you're in the track, they just need to do their job in the track. So you may think they sound great, but you're only hearing a little bit of them. So having those exposed was difficult. I can see that I'm automating something just for that first kick. Oh yeah, and what I'm doing is I'm adding this 4 dB sort of very wide 100 hertz just for the first four, because inside the track, there's no way in hell they can have that much low end. It just, they take up too much space, it gets messy. But for those first 2 bars, it just sounded thin without it. So that, the snare hit afterwards, I'm turning it up. I still feel like that didn't quite, because it needs to be blam, and it's not quite the blam yet, but when I pushed it more, it just sounded out of context and weird. So that was one of the things. It's a real small detail. The use of reverb, we mentioned it, the reverb on the snare, that normally I would try and get it by crushing room mics or distorting in parallel, which I'm doing quite a bit of. There's quite a bit of distortion going into the kit. But this, especially because there is an orchestral arrangement and you have the breakdown, you have to use reverb. You just have to. That it doesn't work to just have a roomy drum kit then. So I've got 2 different reverbs going. One is relatively short. I've got one just for the snare, but then I've got a big snare reverb that is just in the breakdown in the very end, where we come back to that sort of arrangement. The fact that the guitars drop out in the breakdown in the very end, like the most important, loudest thing in the mix is now gone. So what do? That's difficult. Obviously the bass sound needs to change when other things go away, but that's, you know, that's kind of standard stuff. It looks like I only took out about 1/3 of the strings, but I did change the strings because I felt like as you put the arrangement together, it's always trying to look for contrast between sections, but also more about energy between sections. So a lot of times what I will do is I will automate the parallel distortion on the drums. I think I mentioned that earlier, like just bring it in the choruses. But this is just up all the time, except those breakdowns. So it needed it all the way through. So I don't have the ability to like make the drum kit bigger because it can't get bigger. So what I ended up doing instead was to actually use the strings as a bit of a lift because they're above the guitars. So that sort of high mid to treble sustain became the way stuff lifted. And then also by getting rid of it in the verses, I didn't have to bring the vocal up more because I felt like there's so much great guttural tone in the vocal. You don't want to highlight that. You can tuck it in and it will still cut through. So to be able to do that, I didn't want the strings covering up the vocal during the verses. Even with the background vocals, they're mostly supportive. You've got the growl vocal down here and that all works really well, but you've got one line where the background vocals take over. And like, well, come on, man. You're like barely there, you're supporting, you're making stuff sound thicker, and now you're the lead vocal for 2 bars. So how do you make it sound okay for them to take over, but not out of context? And the way they're singing is almost operatic in that spot, which is very different from the way the lead vocal is most of the time. So that was difficult as well. We talked about the brass earlier, and the brass has this great low end to it, but I couldn't really make room for it. So they ended up being a little bit of weight, but not featured maybe the way the orchestrator was expecting them to be. But I think that's also personal preference, and it's why I got rid of strings, and it's why I tried to not use reverb on the drums. That's just my thing. Like that, it's not pop, but it's a pop thing to put reverb on drums, and I'm just so unused to it that it always sounds really foreign to me. Whereas The reverb I use on the snare, which I mentioned earlier, it's pretty short. What is it? It's under a second, and it's pretty bright, and it's an ambience rather than a hall or something like that. So its decay is pretty quick. So again, it's just length rather than reverb. But then in the breakdowns, you need this cinematic reverb for the snare, so that's being automated in. So there are lots of little things, and then also just trying to get all of the weight from the guitars. Fortunately, like we talked about, the bass is doubling the guitar, so I could grab a bunch of low end from them, but there is something about the low end cabinet bloom on a guitar that is completely unlike what happens with a bass. It's nothing like it. It's on the dum 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 dum, like all of those shorter things have this low end kind of almost like an explosion as soon as the note itself stops. Trying to get that to come across without just swamping everything else. So that's what I can remember. There's probably more than that.
Super.
But yeah.
As far as stereo width, are you going for more maximum width or more of a realistic aesthetic? How do you go about the extremes of the panoramic?
Well, I'm not afraid to hard pan, and I'm fine with it. And one of the reasons is because on the mix bus, I use this, which is just it's basically like a mastering EQ, and it's in MS mode and blah, blah, blah. But it has the most transparent stereo width. So I'm actually widening the mix 20%, whatever that means. But what that means is, and it doesn't really come up in this mix very often, but if you hard pan something and then listen in headphones, it actually hurts because your brain likes crosstalk. There's no thing in nature that you would only ever hear in one ear. And that's why it feels so uncomfortable, because your brain is immediately starting to test the eardrum in the other ear. Like, I'm broken, what's going on? Because of using any stereo spread, the way it does it is it takes some sort of phase relationship and changes it and puts it into the right speaker. So I never, I think if I pan at 93% or something like that, that's what gets it just into one speaker. But I never do that. So I can hard pan things and there's just enough crosstalk to make it comfortable in headphones, which is a big deal because a lot of people listen in headphones now.
So with your cymbals, are they fully wide? Are the guitars fully wide?
The guitars are absolutely fully wide. And I played with the panning when they're not playing the same part, because there's only this one section in the song where one of the guitars starts playing more of a chugging part and the other one is playing the riff. Again, that was really, really difficult. I think I've managed to make it work, but I first started thinking like, well, okay, I'll take the two guitar mics that's playing the riff and I'll split those. And then I'll take the other guy and make a mono and move around and try and find space. But the guitar tone changed so much that it was actually more distracting than just letting them all of a sudden play different things. But getting that level right was really difficult because you lose half the riff, so you need to turn the guitar that's left up, or it sounds like everything dips, but you can't have it feel like, oh my God, that guitar just came up a bunch, because then that's super distracting. And the chunky part had this very dense low mid thing that's like, well, that's not great, but then there are some things in the middle of it, and I think this is the section. And I'm doing some clip gain just within what it's playing when it goes between chunks, and there's some chords in the middle, and getting that right took a really long time. But yes, they are hard panned all the way through. I'm sure the overheads are all hard panned. Yep, yeah. Overheads and room. No, the room I brought in a little bit. And the reason for that was the cymbals. There's a cymbal that's on the left that I found really, really distracting, and it's just getting hammered on in some of the sections of the song. And by bringing that into the middle a little bit, it doesn't call as much attention to itself because it's not all the way on the outside. So that was a very specific decision to do that. But normally, yeah, I just leave all that stuff hard panned.
Do you ever apply width processing to the bass in the upper frequencies for this mix or any other mix?
No, never. I will do it to, like, guitar solos, always get a little bit of something, but it's not a stereo width control. It's kind of a weird thing. And I stole it from Chad Blake, basically. So it's an incredibly slow flanger first that's moving really, really slowly, followed by Mondo Mod. So this is basically panning, but it's panning with ultra stereo with processing. So it's trying to be like the old, what was it called? It's not the pan scan. There was a hardware single rack space panner that I can see. It had blue type on it, and it had some phase processing that would make it go in circles. And it never really felt like that, but it was different than just going hard left, hard right. So this is doing that really slowly, and what it gives you is this smearing, and you put just enough in so that everything feels wider, but you never actually hear it do its thing. If you turn it up too much, you hear the flanger, you hear it panning. But just a little bit, and then I'm even widening it after the fact a bit more. Not because that makes it wider, but because you're messing with the phase so much that you just can't tell where it's coming from. So that, sometimes it's used on vocals, sometimes it's on guitar solos. I don't know that I even used it in this mix, to be honest.
Right. Moving back to reverbs on this mix, you've got a fairly short ambient verb on the snare, then we've got a separate toms verb, which is also fairly short.
It is in fact the exact same reverb, but it's, oh no, it's turned down. I think in my template, I believe it's a little longer. Right. And the difference though, is that it has some micro shifting on it.
Stereo width?
No, actually pitch shifting. So, and this came up, I think it was on a Green Day record, where it felt like, I want to go kind of stadium with the toms, and how do you do that? And flanged reverb was sort of a big deal in the, I guess 80s going into early 90s for those sort of pop rock records. And I felt like I wanted to get this weird combination of punk, because keep the Green Day thing, but they play stadiums. So when Trey's playing a drum fill on his own, like how can I do it? And this worked a lot better than a flanger, because if you hear the sweep, then you know it's there. Whereas this is just constantly doing it, and it just makes the reverb on the toms a little special in a way. But back to the challenges, getting the toms to feel like part of the kit was difficult, because you need them to be big and present, but at the same time, the rest of the kit is the kick and snare present, but you don't have a sense of the kit in the same way that you do with like a regular rock mix. So getting the level right and the amount of reverb was something I spent a lot of time on and kept going back to, because one of the fills would pull my ear while I'm doing something else. So yeah, so those reverbs, and then the long guy in the breakdowns.
Yeah, and then you've also got a feed from the drum aux to a verb as well.
Yeah, and this is, it's pretty low. I mean, the output's at 0, but the send, I don't remember what the send is at. Oh no, it's up pretty high, but it ends up not being that loud in the mix. This is just a room, and it's a very good sounding room. What's interesting about it though, especially with this particular plugin, the Liquid Sonics guys are amazing. Yeah. It's got this very low frequency reverb control. So if you take it all the way down, basically the low end gets no reverb. But as you bring it up, it's like a super wide room for the kick drum. So you can make decisions about how wide do I want the kick. And I decided, just because there's not that much low end in the kick, because the bass and the guitars are taking over that job, that I could just leave it up, and it would just help make the kick feel a little bigger without having to add more low end. But again, this is not a gigantic part of the drum sound.
Yeah. Staying with the subject, sorry.
Well, I was just going to point out the only other reverb is on the mix bus. And this is something I do all the time. It's only mixed, is it 15% wet? So you're mostly hearing the fact that this is getting distorted a little bit, but it's only getting mixed in a little bit, and this gives me the sort of smearing you would get with a compressor, but I don't like the way compressors sound on mixes anymore. So this was like my thing, and this is on because it's in my template, and I tried it and it helped out with this particular mix, but it's not something I built for this.
No.
Okay, so anyway.
Of interest is the pickup points that you use for all your reverbs are always from the auxes. You always take your pickup points from the auxes, never from the individual channels?
Pretty much, and it's because I'm lazy. The auxes are in my template.
Right. Okay.
And the other thing is, like, well, if I'm combining the 4 snare tracks you gave me plus the sample I'm adding, why would I want reverb differently off of those tracks? Like, I'm making a snare sound, so I want to send that to something. So it doesn't make sense to me. Now, every once in a while, I will change my mind and I'll do it, but not usually in drums. So I will, have reverb sends on individual tracks. What's this going to? Yeah, I built a reverb for the piano. So that's there. But in general, yeah, I pick them off where it's already in the template. And then if it doesn't work, I'll spend the time. But it is literally because I am lazy. They're there. They're always there. The level is set along with the return. It's all tweaked how I normally like it, and it's my starting point.
There's some producers like Andy Wallace who opts just to take the clean samples to reverb and use that as a reverb send, and
yeah, exactly. I mean, he sort of triggers the reverb as if the reverb were a sample. And believe me, when I found out he did that, I tried it. And then a few years later, I remembered he did that and tried it again. I can't get it to work for me. But yes, and he's the king of it.
Yeah, it's... I think he did it on Nevermind, didn't he? Where it's just,
I mean, I think pretty much everything. That's the way he treats drums, is to trigger the reverb with samples that you don't even necessarily hear. They aren't necessarily the samples that get blended in. No. They're just there to set off the reverb.
Yeah, the faders down, sends pre-fade to reverb. And it's just got this like bright white noise of a sample that just...
And it's great.
And I can't get that to work. Yeah. It's got to be the sample that's
well, and it's the rest of the mix is built for that to work. The context is so different in my mixes, it doesn't surprise me it doesn't work.
And lastly, on the subject of verbs, you've put gating on your snare and tom's reverb returns.
That's just for noise.
Right.
That's all it is. On the way in, it's because this is on the way into the reverb, on the snare reverb. Yeah. This is to keep the hi-hat out. That's all. I only want the snare to get in there. And the tom verb has it on the output because this micro pitch is noisy.
Yeah.
And so again, threshold's really, really, really low. Slightly longer release time, so you don't hear it shut down. Fastest attack time just to get it. So it's about noise. The snare one is about separation. I don't want the hi-hat going to that reverb because it's kind of bright.
And on that subject, do you ever use spill as a cohesive component on your mix? We notice here that you've used the waveform edited toms. Do you ever use tom spill or perhaps snare spill?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this came to me edited, and there isn't a playlist with them unedited. And obviously, I could have just dragged them all out to see what it sounded like. And that may have worked, but I'm lazy again. So I just figured, well, I'm not going to do that. If you guys bothered to chop them, like the last thing in the world I wanted was more of that cymbal on the left. And I thought, well, that's gonna be in two of the tom mics at least. And gating doesn't always work for me. There are times I'll use the drum leveler plugin because it's just really good. You don't have to tweak it for the gate and things. It basically will work. You might have to filter the sidechain kind of thing. So I'll do that just to increase the dynamics between the drum that you are miking and the spill. But generally, I love the spill. That's what makes the kit feel like it's in a room and feel natural to me, and that I really like it most of the time.
Right. Moving on to low-end management, and so a little bit more onto EQ. What low-end management techniques do you typically employ between kick and bass and guitars? Or isn't there?
I don't.
No.
I mean, it's just, is it feeling right? No. Is it feeling right? No. Oh, that's good. That's what happened. Like on this particular mix, the bass para track, I was having trouble. And even on the first mix I sent you, this was not done. And I just was having trouble with the bass. It was kind of easy to get the mid-range to poke through because there's some great distortion sounds on some of these tracks. So that part was easy, but I just felt like the bottom wasn't solid. It would be there and then would kind of disappear. And also, like we said, the bass is doubling the guitars. So you've got to have the low end in the bass because it's going to lend itself to the guitars and extend them down. And I flipped the phase on this just out of curiosity. I think I dragged this plugin up and down every track trying to see what happened. And all of a sudden, the mid-range wasn't as cool, but the low end just happened. So that was part of the bass management. I also knew because of how busy the kick was, it can't drive the low end because it was going to be really obvious when it wasn't playing. So that couldn't happen, so it had to be the bass. I mean, but that's as far as that goes. I never sidechain things. I'm sure I should. I just don't.
No. Moving onwards, do you have any general sort of tendencies with down-tuned guitars like this, where you're looking at the lower frequencies and the way that we've talked about the low end of the bass and the low end of the guitars. Do you have any sort of like ideas about how to get the note definition in with the bass, or clearing the bass away from the low end, or scooping the guitars out and letting the bass pop its head out in that
generally
region?
don't think about that between instruments, but on guitars, and we'll see if I'm doing it here. I think I must be. Yeah, I'll find the frequency that is the note. Normally this would be around 1.4, but obviously tuning down to C, it's dropped to about 1K. So I'll sweep that until I get the sort of hunky note where you're nearer the fundamental, but it's not painful and it's also below the vocal. And turning that up will make it sound like the guitar is louder, because that frequency is something that will really poke out, and you hear kind of the pick on the strings, that sort of thing, which to me makes the guitars easier to hear.
Yeah. And we talked earlier about, on the Scheps Omni plugin, the de-esser that's on there, and the way that you use that almost like dynamic EQ.
Yeah, absolutely. Like on this guitar, on all the guitars, I am sucking out 4.2K, very, very narrowly. And it was only because something was bugging me. It's like, man, there's a frequency that's constant and it's hurting my ears. Go hunting for it and then get the threshold to where it happens. I mean, something like that with the distortion on guitars that are just playing the whole song, I probably could have done it with EQ, but I'm very used to sucking out those frequencies using the de-essers. Yeah, and I love them. Love that they're full frequency. I actually use them in the low mids probably as much, if not more, than I do in the upper frequencies.
Really? And with the guitars, you've not got that much processing on the individual channels. You've just got a little bit of saturation taking place.
There's nothing on the individual tracks, and then I've split them into left and right. There's no saturation on there, just some EQ. Right. To bring out the note. Then the two guitars are going into an aux. That's getting some saturation. And the even. Normally I'm all about the heavy because you get a lot more harmonic content, but obviously there's already a lot of distortion, but there was something about the mids that just didn't feel filled up enough, for lack of a better phrase. Probably because I'm adding distortion to the drums, so that takes up mid-range room. Therefore I need more mid-range out of the guitars, so that gets the boost, but I wasn't getting enough out of the boost, so add a little saturation. Then this opto compressor, it's probably not even compressing. It's more the makeup gain comes up when you drag that threshold down, and I'm just really used to it. So I use that for some gain, and then actually just use the output to bring the gain up, because I'd already done rides, and I could have done trim automation or use the output to bring it up. So that's just a balance thing.
And staying with the guitars, do you ever use either multi-band compression or dynamic EQ for kind of like controlling those chug thump, the way the bloom with the down
No,
picking?
I don't. And one of the reasons is because any multi-band thing has crossovers in it, and they're not phase coherent unless you use something with like 1.5 seconds of processing time. I mean, I'm exaggerating, but to get linear phase crossovers in a plugin, the delay through the plugin has to be very long. That's how you build them. There's no other way to build a digital phase coherent crossover. And I hear that phasiness, especially in guitars, because they've got a ton of information at every frequency. So you're never going to find the crossover point which doesn't disturb the guitar. So never. And I don't use a lot of multiband compression ever, kind of because of that, but also because I don't directly compress that much stuff. It's usually parallel, which means you're blending it in. So you can't have non-phase coherent things in something you're blending.
Sure. And your EQ, again, similar with the drums where it's mainly on the auxes, you tend to apply it on the aux rather than the individual channels.
Yeah, I mean the snare mics got EQ and a lot of saturation to try and just give me more to EQ. I think, yeah, both snare tops got it. Didn't need to on the bottom ones, you know, they're just sort of used however they're used. But yeah, mostly on the auxes, though drums especially, I will go in and EQ certain things. But the toms I didn't really need to, they just needed overall stuff. But I will do that because the toms, it's all about balancing them. So, because there are a few fills that go around all 4 toms, and I've got them really wide because I think that's appropriate for the song, and they've got a lot of attack, so they have to be balanced right. And that's not just the attack, each one has to have as much tone as the other. But because of the recording, I was able to just do it with some overall stuff.
And from that perspective about balancing the toms, you obviously feel that when the toms are all balanced, you'll take the reverb send from the toms aux.
Exactly. Why would I do it separately? They're going to end up at the same level anyway. Yeah. I'm making toms. I don't need to put reverb individually on each tom. They're all going to get it.
Yep. Yep. And an interesting approach that I saw with vocal processing, am I right in saying you've used a Pultec to drive certain frequencies into an LA2A that you subsequently attenuate those frequencies afterwards?
Yeah. So yeah, it's in my template and I've used it for years. So I'll bring up all 3 plugins so you can see. So this is the processing order. This is actually like a 90s East Coast pop vocal thing. And this would be directly on the vocal, but I do it parallel. So basically what you do is you get rid of all the low end, you boost the crap out of around 8K, then you put it into a compressor. And hardware-wise, they usually used LA2As. So this way, you're compressing only based on the mid-range. It doesn't turn it into a multi-band compressor. And I think when people are learning, they kind of think like, oh, you're EQing into that, it's like a multi-band compressor. Like, no. But because there's no low end, it won't compress based on low end in the vocal. It'll just hammer it when there's mid-range, which is most of the time. And then after that, you add a bunch of low end back in. And then I'm actually adding 20K on top. And this was pointed out to me because Pultecs are weird. It works in triangles. Those 3 work off that frequency. So you get boost and attenuation at that frequency. This triangle is the boost for mid-range. So it has bandwidth, boost and attenuation and that frequency. Sorry, boost and that frequency. This attenuation gets that frequency. But I had this set up at 8. And I thought, great, adding the 8K back in. Then it was pointed out to me that I'm an idiot and was doing it wrong. And so I'm like, okay, fine, I'll put this down to 10, and I hated it. So I just left it at 20. But that's it. So you basically EQ the vocal a lot as if you had a sidechain EQ on the detector circuit in the LA2A. I mean, that's basically what you're doing. And you don't. But it works very differently from anything else. But the point being that that's just being blended into the vocal. So what it does, it's a parallel compressor, but it's basically just the mid-range. So it just makes the vocal very easy to hear without having to turn it up and without really changing the tone.
Fascinating.
And there's only a little bit. I mean, it's at -14, which is a little bit higher than normal, but...
Superb. And then moving on a little bit, the overall, generally, your approach with saturation and distortion. We briefly talked about the guitars where there's quite a lot of distortion in there anyway, so you went for the even harmonics with the saturation. Continuing with the theme, you actually used a devil lock over the drum aux.
Oh, and there's more than was on the session that I sent you. So yeah, there's a lot going on. So the first thing is, off of here there's a send to the drums dirt. This is blended in, it's very quiet, but this is the just glue stuff together thing. This is what I was talking about before, where reverb doesn't do it, so distortion does because it's got all that mid-range stuff. And that is, it's distorting the crap out of it. It's a trash 2, it's in crazy mode, and then it's just got lots of EQ going out and some EQ going in. So that's a parallel thing, along with a bunch of parallel compressors and stuff like that, sort of normal. Then there's the devil lock. Now it's mixed almost completely dry. There's only a little bit mixed in, it's like less than 1, but it has a very distinctive sound. Nothing else sounds like, I mean, and this doesn't sound anything like the level lock, because level lock, which is what this is based on, has a microphone level input, so the impedance is different, like everything about it is different. But this is something that just has a great sound, so a tiny bit of it, again, just helps mush the drums together. But then I've gone nuts here. So I've got 2 more distortion boxes. One of them is on a multi-band split. This is the Wave Studio Rack plugin, which is great. You can chain their plugins and things, but they've got built-in either frequency splits or parallel splits. So I've got a multi-band split that's set at 85. So below 85, nothing gets processed at all. And then I've got this, which is one of their newer plugins, and it is awesome on drums. So it's just distortion with 2 different types, and then top end tweaks on the way in and the way out. And then after that, I've got a parallel split where the entire full frequency drum kit goes through, and then I'm blending in this pi limiter set on stun. I mean, this is crazy town, but it's blended in very low. This is at -23. So it's just a tiny, tiny bit of it as another parallel compressor to go along with all the other parallel compressors I've got. But this one is more about that like 1176 with all buttons in, or when you really slam a limiter. That's what this thing is doing and just being brought in. So it's all about having the very, very clean kick and the very, very separated snare, but still gluing them into the rest of the drum kit. That's the goal with all this stuff.
And on the subject of limiting, you've used an L2 Ultra Maximizer on the toms, but you've not used a limiter, correct me if I'm wrong, elsewhere on the drums, on the snare or the kick?
No. This is purely for level. That's it.
Yeah.
It was just like, well, I want to leave the toms fader at 0 probably, because what if I want to automate them? So I'll just put an L2 on there because it's pretty transparent. And I don't mind if I'm taking off a little bit of the transient with the toms usually. But like I say, this is almost never actually limiting. It's just a fader more than anything.
And with the bass, coming back to the bass, there's no compression or limiting on the bass on this mix, if I'm not mistaken.
Correct. A little bit of that de-essing I was talking about, sucking out a tiny bit of 170, but yeah.
And that's because you feel the bass is dynamically stable enough already due to the distortion, the drive?
Especially, well, for 2 reasons. One, once I found the phase relationship on the para track, but then also because the entire bass track is going through the Sans amp. So this, it's sort of like a 4-band saturator in a way. The buzz is nothing but low end, and then you kind of work your way up to drive. And it doesn't work exactly like that, but they are focused in those different frequency ranges. And this, even if you're not distorting it, which it didn't need more distortion really, it does help kind of even things out. So yeah, I almost never compress, but the bass and guitars, keyboards and vocals are all going to a parallel compressor that's shared between all of them. So they are getting compressed parallel, but yeah, no direct compression.
That's the rear bus.
Yeah.
And the rear bus, does that tend to change with how you use the rear bus? Because it's adding some more density in the mid-range. Yeah. How you use that? Do you tend to change how much you drive it, how much you drive the 1176?
No, there's a VCA somewhere where I could. There's a rear bus master down here, a master fader, so I could pull down what goes into it. I never, ever do it. It's just, I've got a VCA at the bottom of the session, which is called parallel. That's the return of all the drum parallels, return of the rear bus, return of a couple of the vocal things, and I just pull that up and down until I like it, and then later on I move it up and down until I like it, and that's it.
Great. So. And moving onwards, we've discussed your rear bus, we've discussed sort of saturation, we discussed various compression, bass and guitars. If we just move on to finally onto master bus processing, you've got some quite detailed master bus EQ whereby you've got some dips in the lows and at 409 hertz. And
it's changed a little bit since you saw it. The first thing is, I think I still had the SSL compressor on when I sent it. That's now gone. Yeah. I hated that. This EQ had a bigger dip at a lower frequency.
Yeah.
This is the reason this exists is really odd to me, but basically I was sent a mix to mix, but every mix comes to you already mixed, and now you have to mix the mix. And they had a UAD ATR 102 plugin on, which is a great sounding plugin, but people go nuts with it. And then you can't undo it. Like, it's impossible to undo because it's doing so much. But there was a time where I thought, you know what? I don't like what it's doing, but the EQ shape of it changes so much when I take it out that I first used the Q clone from Waves, and then you have no control over that. So I thought, well, no, I need to be able to tweak it a little bit. So I used the EQ matching on the FabFilter Pro Q3, which, I mean, this is an EQ that most people use, like, on everything. I'd never use it. I use it for brick wall filtering if I need it, and for this. But so I got it to match, and you'll see there are a bunch of bands up top that were crazy, and I just got rid of all of them, and ended up with this EQ curve. And it's like a mastering curve, basically. So yeah, that's why this exists. I was trying to match the tone of the ATR without any of the harmonic distortion and weird tape artifacts and all that kind of stuff.
Interesting. And from here, you were mentioning that you'd taken off the SSLG bus compressor.
Yeah.
What was the reason for that?
Nothing sounds better than volume, right? That's the first thing. You could put up a Neve 1073 and, I mean, I don't know what, but something not great. And if the something not great is even half a dB louder than the Neve, unless the not great thing really sucks, you're going to want the thing that's louder. Yeah. That's it. So I try to be very good about matching the makeup gain on the SSL, which is something I used on a project like 3 or 4 records ago, got something I actually really liked, and thought, okay, cool, let me put that in the template, because maybe I'm going to start liking compression again. When I did this mix the first time, I messed with some things and realized actually it was just making the mix louder. So I matched the makeup gain and, like, no, it's got to go. Didn't like it.
Interesting. That is all the questions from here. I'm just wondering whether you want to play some different audio tracks and talk us through any processing moves.
Yeah, just let me know what you want to hear.
Let's just have a listen to, with the drums, if we solo the drums, then just mute certain things and discuss some of the gestures that you're applying, it'd be great.
Yeah, well, I mean, here's some drums. You can hear that reverb is crazy, but the guitars eat it completely.
Yeah.
So that cymbal, it sounds very in context here, but again, the frequencies around it get eaten to the point where all you're left with is kick, snare, and that cymbal. You don't get this kind of picture of the kit, which I think you're getting now. Like the processing with the distortion, I'll show you that. If I take off the pi, it's not going to change a huge amount. It kind of contains the snare a little bit. It's sort of its main job. But this guy up here, the magma thing, is... And then if we take out the drum's dirt, it's very, very quiet on this one, so it's not doing as much. But again, you can hear in the attack of the snare and the attack of the toms, it just makes the attack a bit longer. And to me, that reverb, the amount of it just sounds absolutely crazy to me with the drum solo.
Put the guitars in, get soaked up.
Yeah, it's gone. It's gone, and that's why it exists, actually, because what happens is, especially with a drum balance like this, where the kick needs to be as pointy, everything starts to feel separated. So you need the length on the snare to get you to the next kick drum. That's the point of it, really.
Absolutely. And then with the parallel processing, we just see the levels.
Oh, yeah. Good God. I mean, who knows even? So this is just kick and snare. This is usually the thing. It's just sort of tickling the threshold. But if we solo up kick and snare, you barely hear a difference. Oh, hold on. That's not soloing for some reason. That's a me not knowing how to run Pro Tools. What am I doing here? I don't know. We'll get rid of that and just solo the auxes. Maybe that'll do it. Yeah, okay. That's better.
Yeah.
Again, it drives the snare a little bit. I mean, it is level as well. It's also, it's multi-mono. On kick and snare, it doesn't really matter on a rock track, but when you're doing stuff with more programming, things can really start leaning one way or the other or moving. So I generally tend towards multi-mono compression. It's kind of irrelevant on this particular one. Then the entire drum kit, there are 3 more parallel compressors. What am I going to do? I guess I'll just take out all of them and then we'll put them in one at a time. So this is, that's the Devil Lock. Again, it's presence, but the thing about this is the Devil Lock absolutely destroys things. So what's important is that the send to the Devil Lock is barely on, because that way the Devil Lock will only grab on transients, whereas if you turn it up at all, it just says woohoo and it smashes the crap out of it. And I didn't want that. What I wanted, I actually started using it on a very sort of quiet record that had a lot of detail in the snare, and I really wanted to bring up all of these amazing just roughs and all the detail that was going on in the performance. And then I found out it worked on everything, as things do. So I just kept it in the template. The next 2 are much more sort of standard parallel compressors. Again, they all kind of do the same thing, but when you blend them in, they have different frequency things. So Fairchild, who doesn't want to put a Fairchild on drums, right? Then the next one is a Fatso. I got really sick of the Fairchild at one point, so I built a Fatso one, and then I got sick of the Fatso and I was too lazy to build a 3rd one, so I thought, well, what if I bring the thing back and we'll use them both? Like, okay, that works. So individually, they all kind of are doing the same sort of thing, but here's all of them, and with all of them gone. It's energy.
Yep.
To me, especially with the drums, it's about the energy, and it just feels like the drummer's leaning forward.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So that's what those do.
And then onto the bass, if we just have a listen to the blend of the different signals that you've gone through here with the different tracks.
Yeah. This is where I ended up. So you got your clean DI, and it's really just for that sound of the attack more than anything. Then you wouldn't think that this track would affect the low end as much as it does. It's kind of insane what a difference it made, but that's that guy, so it's a little quieter. This one I really like. This is that grinding sound that I love. Yeah. And then you got the amp itself, which is actually cleaner than you would think, because a lot of that is the sound of the bass. It's not distortion on the amp, because it's in every track. So together, though, what I ended up doing was, I felt like the low end was just not consistent, so I was just going through tracks, figuring out if it was a phase problem, and I phase flipped the para track, and this is with it the other way. The mid-range is better, but the low end just happens, and especially in the track you can hear it. So yeah, that's the blend on that. And the processing, again, this will actually change the tone quite a bit, and it's a lot of level, as it turns out.
And then the drums with the bass.
And I'm also sucking out a little 170. This was done before I had flipped the polarity on the para track, so it could be that I don't need this anymore, but what that was is that the low end was so inconsistent, and it seemed to be inconsistent at around 170, so I just tried to decrease the importance of that frequency range.
And a brief look at the guitars.
Yeah. So guitars, it's tough. What was interesting to me is there's this feel to them on the rough mix that you did, and on a lot of albums where it's hard to explain. It's almost like this rubbery thing that feels really natural and awesome. And instead of being like, they get a little bit more of a personality to them. And I can't recreate it. I don't know why it's in the rough and not in my mix, and I can't do it. So I just decided to go for the raw version of it. There's, again, not a huge amount of processing, nothing on the tracks themselves. They're hard panned. I've got that little bit of EQ that I talked about at around 1K to bring out tone. I have a feeling I just option dragged this one here and didn't end up changing anything. I thought that I might. Yeah. And then on the aux that's getting both of those guitars, there's another one of these guys, and that's giving us that even saturation, tiny bit of compression for level, and adding more of the same, a little bit higher, 1.2, followed by, oh right, so this is very similar, and it's what gave me the idea for the thump here, but the thump didn't work on the guitars, so I went to the thing that had inspired it, which is the Helios EQ, where you just switch the circuit in, so there's no gain at 60 hertz, but because it's at 60 hertz, it is an EQ, but it feels like it's just sort of resonating. So, I mean, I don't know if we'll hear it or not, but there's just this tiny bit of extra here, which is that whole cabinet thump I was talking about earlier. And I think if I take out all three of these EQs, you'll just hear the presence kind of disappear, which maybe that's what I'm doing wrong to get the feel of the guitar from the rough. But now that I've made the drums so much more dense, I needed it to bring it up. Okay, a lot of level there, but actually what I'll do then is, let me leave this in. So yeah, it's 1.2 and then 2.2, and some more low end. So I'm doing this parametric and boosting it at 105.
Is there a little bit of very top in there as
yeah,
well?
Yeah, tiny bit of shelf up at 6K, 7K.
Yeah.
So it feels like level. And this is something, you know, I tell students all the time, is that EQ is better than a fader. You know, because if you just make it louder, it's louder at all the frequencies it has, which is going to cover up other stuff. Whereas EQ is having a fader just at that frequency. So, and I don't think people think about it. They think about the EQ as shaping the tone, and then they'll balance. And I won't do that at all. I'll balance, and then when the balance isn't right, then I start EQing. Once everything's in, every once in a while you really want to push something or bring it down a lot, but generally what you want to do is bring it up where there's room for it without destroying everything else about your balance. So that's the way I use EQ quite often.
Interesting. And can we just have a look at the parallel processing on the vocal with the Pultec going into the LA2A?
Yep. Again, it's very quiet on this mix, but I'm sure you're going to hear it.
Race Jericho's fallen walls. My victorious wordless battle.
It's right in that growly range, and I think in the track actually is where it'll be a bigger difference.
From the solitude of Trojan's heart. From the solitude of Trojan's heart.
It just sinks, whereas this makes that mid-range just a solid block, and it never goes away, and it's above the guitars.
Perfect. Andrew Scheps, thank you very much indeed. That was fascinating. Absolutely brilliant.
Well, thanks for having me. Too much metal for one hand?